So let's rewind. Let's go back to before the current console manufacturers had taken their stage. Back to before Sega had a mascot capable of threatening the Nintendo crown. When after the great video game crash of the 1980s, there really was only one dominant Japanese company left king while several others were scrabbling around for competition. Sega was another Japanese company with ambitions to become a major competitor. And though the Master System was in many respects a more powerful console, Nintendo's dominance of the market and insistence on exclusivity meant that Sega had to cope with a starvingly small library of titles. However, the architecture of the Master System was redeveloped by Sega, and within a few years they were back with the Mega Drive, or Genesis as they then sold it in America, which was built using the same foundational systems and was extremely nearly backwards compatible in that just a small add-on was needed to allow the Master System cartridges to fit. In time, this new console would boast a library of 900 games, and it would close the gap on Nintendo. But in the beginning, when the Genesis launched in North America in 1989, it already had a lineup of several impressive titles. But as Sega looked ahead, they knew that they needed to maintain that momentum. Their own mascots were receiving strong reviews for the games, but only a few, such as Alex Kidd or Golden Axe, showed franchise potential. They needed a recognisable name that would reliably sell. To that end, they approached Disney, a company who boasted the largest franchises in all of entertainment, and Sega began negotiating the rights to produce their very own game, starring the titular mouse. This was not Mickey's first rodeo, not by a long shot. For over a decade, Disney had been licensing a whole range of classic animated characters to developers such as Kemco, Sierra, Nintendo, Hudson Soft, Atari, Capcom, and more besides. The list was small, but it was growing quickly as Mickey, Donald, Goofy, and the wider Disney cast, they were shoehorned into existing franchises, all to give the developers a marketing uplift. But Sega was keen to make a standout original platformer, a benchmark for the quality of their new console. And so designer Emiko Yamamoto was tasked with putting the game together, producing a design that would excite the gaming audience, but interestingly it also had to meet Disney's stringent restrictions. There was a whole checklist of things that the House of Mouse would not allow. Primarily, the biggest obstacle was that Mickey could not fight or punch, so they settled on having him throw apples or other collectibles to defeat enemies, or alternatively, stick out his rear end to bop them on the head for a satisfyingly high bounce attack. Emirin, a name she chose as Sega had this rule in place at the time that didn't permit their staff to be credited under their full names, had her team study the Disney Animation Archive and work as hard as possible to recreate the style of Disney on the 16-bit hardware. Extra frames of animation were added to keep the game in the style of the film, an extravagance that affected the game design as they had to increase the height and float of Mickey's jump to allow the artwork to be fitted in. It's an odd way of going about the game design, but in this instance they managed to find a sweet spot where the pixel art lovingly recreates the old Disney animation as closely as possible, and it's fun to play. So keen was the team that this may be the first video game platformer to offer an idle animation. This extra animation is a completely unnecessary addition from a pure gameplay perspective, but one done with the aim of making the game come as alive as a playable cartoon. Plot-wise, they settled on an original character who closely homages the Queen from Snow White, and they named her Mizrabel, after the musical Les Mis that was popular at the time. The idea was that Mickey would travel through various worlds which were themed off areas from old Disney properties, and a cast of villains were selected from the film archive. It wasn't meant to look like any specific Disney film, but a hodgepodge of all of them, remixed and reinterpreted as an almost child-friendly version of a fever dream. The game also boasted a soundtrack that pushes the Mega Drive sound chip to its limits to complement the bright, garish visuals. Castle of Illusion was released in the second wave of Mega Drive games, around a year after the console's launch and another year before Sega struck gold with their own Blue Hedgehog. Compared to what followed, the game is a little slow and unwieldy, but it set a high bar for the new hardware, and it showed that they could combine art style, sound design and solid gameplay mechanics to produce an engrossing experience. Castle of Illusion was one of the first licensed game on the Mega Drive, and Sega promoted it heavily. Its success led to a range of sequels, all using Disney licensed properties, most notably Quackshot with Donald Duck, World's Volution, which was a true sequel starring both Mickey and Donald, and then several other direct movie adaptations for the system. Designer Emiko moved to Disney full time, and when Sega lost the license, she then worked with a range of other video game developers, acting as a senior producer on the Kingdom Hearts games through to 2013. This was yet another series where the player travelled through multiple Disney worlds, fighting off an array of enemies on a quest to rescue their kidnapped friend. I suppose some concepts are just too good to only use once. I'd recommend Castle of Illusion as a pretty great game. It's short, it doesn't overstay its welcome, but it's got oodles of retro charm. And if you're looking for a very early but advanced form of a 16-bit platformer, this is a really good starting place after you've had the normal big hitters like Mario and Sonic.